going to start with a story today. So we have an errant upstart militant uprising in some part of the Middle East. This is time 2014. They have more resources. They just got kicked out of Al-Qaeda. They have absolutely no training at all. They are a group on the verge of extinction. We see that in Syria. The USA is not engaging directly with Syrians and is sending third-party trainers there. So this upstart military group goes there, receives training from the US, gets access to US exclusive technology, and now 2 years down the line, what do we see? This upstart militant group, which calls itself ISIS, is a global threat. People from all over the world, from Dhaka to Montenegro to Quebec to even some people that live in Antarctica, all of them are scared, ladies and gentlemen. And this comes into force not only through the impact that it has on the social lives of people, in the way we portray ourselves and the way we behave, but it also comes out in terms of economic harms. We see that in Turkey, for example. The number of Russian tourists entering after that last recent attack by ISIS has decreased by 90%. That is the global impact of ISIS, and we tell you, even if the US did not create ISIS, it certainly gave it a helping hand, a very large helping hand, based on what we've seen today. This is why we tell you that Obama's diplomatic disengagement is false. This is the analysis we provided right from Abe and Akash, and they haven't touched it at all. This is the greatest harm we have in the modern day century, larger than Bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, and if they don't tell us how they deal with this harm, then we consider their point to be moot. We win this debate entirely. But because I have 6 more minutes to talk about, I'll be doing all of my speaker roles here. First, I'd like to start with a couple of rebuttals on the ideas that Second Opposition made. After that, I'll move on to 2 of my questions. So, from Second Up, we heard on the idea of intervention that in terms of ISIS, the US couldn't do anything, that there was no option to create a stable government. That's why it's the best thing he could do. We give you 2 responses to that. Firstly, we understand that when the USA chose to withdraw from Iraq, we saw that Republican leaders of the Congress, that people like John McCain, were vehemently opposed to that, right? The same Congress they tell us opposing it, they wanted more military intervention, which we tell you would have been better, right? Because of the analysis that Akash has already provided about the situation in Iraq, how it's divided as a country, how it's a mess, right? We tell you this is happening. They tell us absolutely nothing about that. And the idea of creating a stable government. Secondly, we see that the Iraqi government was voted in by its people. It was a democratic process. It wasn't the US making a puppet out of Iraq, as opposition mischaracterizes, right? This is why we tell you their ideas in Iraq are completely false. But let's look at the idea of what happens in the harm of credibility. I'll be dealing with directly with my clash. But I'll give you one small attempt. Like I said in my POI, it's an entire assumption from Team UAE to say that that is what Israel wanted behind the scenes, when we know that the Israeli Prime Minister was so against this idea, so against the deal, that he went to the American Parliament and criticized Obama in front of his entire Congress, right? In that kind of empirical evidence we tell you this is a complete assumption. It's absolutely wrong from opposition to make us defend that idea. But finally, on the idea of Syria, the idea of it being empirically false, that's not the point here. The real issue is that Obama said that he would militarily intervene if chemical weapons were deployed, right? He didn't do that. That's why he fails, right? That's why we tell you Syria is behaving the way it is right now. Because Obama made a bluff and Syria called upon it, right? That's the problem we see today. On the final substantive about global warming, we agree that global warming is important, just as much as we agree that LGBTQ rights are important. What we don't agree, however, is the short-term impacts. What's going to happen? Maybe we see that global warming is a long-term solution. That's cool, right? And we tell you that this would have happened under any other president anyway, because America has always been putting forward the alliance of global warming. But what we tell you, more importantly, is that in the short term, the idea of global warming and LGBTQ is just disguised to go away from concepts like ISIS, concepts like Israel, right? This is what we tell you. UAE is providing marginal benefits to hide the major substantive harms that Obama has done throughout his foreign policy. This brings us to my clash, but before that, I'll take you.
Okay, is global warming not an important goal that affects millions of people?
It is an important goal. If you had listened to us, you would see that we told you it's very important in the long term. We agree to that. But right now, it's a marginal benefit compared to the harms that are posed by things like ISIS. We agree that it's the greatest harm humanity has ever faced, right, in terms of modern-day terrorism. And they tell us that that's not important, but something that's probably going to work 50 or 100 years down the line is more important than that. We disagree with that analysis. So let's look at the clashes here. First, on the idea of has military disengagement been the right step? On opposition, we hear the idea that yes, because it has reduced global conflict, de-escalated wars, increased multinational institutions, and finally, world disarming itself. 2 responses to all of this. First, on the idea of de-escalation, they give us the examples of things like Crimea, right? We tell you that at that particular time, human rights were violated significantly by countries like Russia, right? That's what the cost of diplomacy is. You're harming an entire autonomous state just to provide supposed diplomatic assistance. We tell you that's completely unfair on real-world comparatives, right? Because these people are still against the idea of being annexated by Russia. They don't really explain to you the consequences in terms of the lives of these people that were supposed to be a part of the Ukraine, right? Until they provide us analysis otherwise, we tell you that this is completely false. On the idea of the world disarming itself, it is a general principle, it's nice, that we would rather want it, right? But we need to consider this, not just in a vacuum, but in real-world consequences. At a time when ISIS, when Taliban, and even when Al-Qaeda is rising up, when it's causing harm to all the global community, maybe we think it's not a good time to give up all our arms and say, oh, diplomacy will save us. We can't act diplomatically against ISIS, right? They're not going to come here and sit on the table and discuss. We can't charge sanctions to ISIS. That's how you're supposed to deal with other consequences, right? You can't do that with ISIS. That's why we tell you that their diplomacy has not actually worked that well. On our side, we tell you that diplomacy, this military disengagement, has not been the right approach, particularly in terms of Iraq, when we told you that it's been mishandled, that the country is continually suffering from all the violations that have happened. Abhay and Akash both told you that it's not about just inheriting. When Obama took over as president, he willfully inherited that, right? He made it his responsibility. The first thing he said when he came into power was, we must be as careful coming out of Iraq as we were careless getting in. Has that happened? Absolutely not. We see that as a major diplomatic failure. Sit down, man. But on the issue of things like Syria, right? We told you already the idea of red line and what that has done in terms of credibility. That it has actually, but sit down, sir. But finally, on the idea of Bashar al-Assad and his actions, right? We tell you this probably would have been prevented had the US actually acted upon its threats. This brings us to my second class, which is the idea of what is the impact of the loss in US credibility. Here's what we've told you, and here's what UAE has completely ignored. First, the idea that in countries like Pakistan, where it's imperative to deal with terrorism as a major threat, Pakistan is doing so unilaterally because of the harm that USA caused during the killing of bin Laden. We tell you that it's important that they killed it, but the way they did it is absolutely wrong because it harms how we deal as a global community against the major threat that is terrorism. There's no analysis at all from opposition, which is why we tell you we take that point. But more importantly, what has this harm in US credibility done? It has encouraged terrorists and tyrants. It's why Syria is acting even more against human rights violations. It's why ISIS is not scared anymore. It's why we see at least once a week there's an attack somewhere around the global community. That is an absolute harm, we tell you, happened directly because of Obama's reluctance to act when it was needed. So because of all these reasons, and because we also provide you every single alternative thing that he should have actually done in his tenure, we on Proposition have never been covered before.